The northern coastal city lived under a low ceiling of smoke and salt. Chimneys along the harbor vomited gray threads into the sky. The air tasted of iron and wet stone, and the wind always carried the distant echo of waves crashing against the piers. Nights belonged to the howl beyond the walls, to the shift of paws on frozen ground, to yellow eyes watching from the tree line. In that city, where the boundary between human streets and shifter territory was measured not in fences, but in fear, a girl named Myra was born. Rumors moved through her mother's family like an old draft. On long winter evenings, relatives lowered their voices when they spoke of certain ancestors, of women who heard too much, knew much, and ended badly. Someone had once called it a gift, but the word never sounded like a blessing. By the time Myra learned to walk, her mother already watched her with a quiet, stubborn hope that this time the strange inheritance would pass them by. Myra was lively, quick to laugh, ordinary in all the ways that reassured adults. For a while, the house on the sloping street above the docks felt almost safe. The night that hope broke apart came with a storm. Wind clawed at the shutters, rain beat against the roof, and somewhere beyond the city's last row of warehouses, wolves were howling in a ragged, uneven chorus. Myra lay awake, counting heartbeats when the first alien thought slid into her mind. It did not come as a voice from the outside. It surfaced inside her own head, wrapped in the familiar color of her own thinking, and yet absolutely not her. It smelled of sour fear and burning tar. It imagined splintered wood and a man crushed beneath cargo he had ordered to be moved despite warnings. She saw a flash of the docks, a broken crane, blood washed by rain. She did not understand what she was seeing, but the sensation left her trembling and cold. When her father returned from the port just before dawn, soaked and silent, she went to him with the instinctive openness of a 9-year-old. She tried to ask how his night had gone. Instead, her tongue and lips shaped something else, something that did not belong to her. Her mouth described the accident, the snapped cable, the worker pinned under the crate, the shout he had ignored when he ordered the men to keep going despite the storm. Her own voice betrayed her, dragging from the darkness of his mind details she could not possibly know. He froze with his coat still half off, staring at her as if she had turned into something transparent and dangerous. The next day, news spread through the neighborhood about the death at the docks, the storm that had taken not only cargo but a life. Myra watched her father avoid meeting her eyes and understood, in the blunt, merciless way children sometimes understand, that something inside her had shifted irreversibly. Her mother realized faster than anyone what was happening. There had been stories of this exact thing, words that slipped, confessions that burst out uninvited, secrets stripped bare by a single startled question. Women who broke under the constant noise in their heads, who could not sleep because other people's fears crowded their own. The family had no priests to run to, no healers capable of silencing thoughts. All her mother had were old instructions, passed down in whispers from one frightened generation to the next. The only protection they knew lay not in magic, but in deliberate silence. So the training began. At first it was framed as a game, a challenge to see how long a child could stay quiet. Then it became a rule: no unnecessary words, no casual remarks, no replies spoken aloud even to simple questions. Myra learned to nod, to shake her head, to use hands and glances instead of sounds. Each time she tried to speak, the city around her seemed to push more voices into her mind. Neighboring quarrels, small envies, private plans, all tangled with her own thoughts until she felt as if she were drowning in a crowd that existed only in her skull. The decisive moment came when a visiting clerk from the harbor office sat at their table, complaining about the unfairness of taxes and the weight of the Alpha's regulations. He smiled at Myra, asked her name, tried to coax a word from her. Her resolve slipped, just for a second. She opened her mouth to answer. What fell out was not her name, but his intention to steal from the records, to hide the missing cargo in forged entries, to blame the loss on a storm that had not yet happened. She saw the shock in his eyes, the suspicion, the immediate calculation of risk. Her mother's hand tightened painfully on her shoulder before the man could collect himself enough to accuse her of witchcraft. After that, the decision was final. Myra became the girl who did not speak. An illness was invented for the neighbors, a fever that had supposedly burned through her throat, leaving her mute. It was easier for people to accept a damaged voice than the idea that a child's words could peel back their carefully constructed facades. Her father stopped inviting colleagues over. Her mother erased any trace of old family legends from casual conversation. Inside their small house, the air thickened with unspoken instructions and the constant low buzz of thoughts leaking through the walls from the busy street outside. Outside, the city followed its own rules. The shifter clans governed the docks, the trade routes, the smuggling lines that slipped between law and survival. At the top of their tangled hierarchy stood one alpha, Raynar, whose name carried the weight of order and threat in equal measure. The municipal council existed mostly for appearances. Real decisions were made in back rooms and under the watch of wolves who walked on 2 legs by day and 4 by night. People learned to live with that reality because the ships kept coming, the factories kept running, and the predators at least were predictable. Myra grew up inside this dual world, watching human fear and shifter discipline weave around each other like 2 currents in the same dark sea. She saw how thoughts shifted when patrols of wolves crossed the square, how resentment turned into forced respect, how secret admiration for their strength coexisted with the memory of past violence. She did not have to guess what people felt. It pressed against her mind every time she entered a crowded market or went to fetch water, a rolling tide of petty worries and sudden, sharp flashes of hatred or longing. When the fire came, it did not feel like destiny. It felt like bad wiring, neglect, and the dry wind that ran down from the northern cliffs. A single spark in a neighboring building turned into a hungry orange jaw that swallowed half the street. Smoke invaded the house before the flames did, thick and choking, and the usual noise of other minds collapsed into a single, shared panic. Someone's terror of suffocation bled into her own. Someone else's instinct to save possessions at any cost jammed her muscles when she tried to move. She stumbled through heat and shouting, hands scraped raw on stone, lungs filled with ash. She did not see how the roof fell, only felt the moment when the familiar presence of her mother's thoughts winked out like a candle pinched between fingers. Her father's fear dissolved at nearly the same instant. Afterwards, when the ash settled and the street became a charred skeleton of its former self, Myra sipped thin water in a temporary shelter and understood that the silence inside her heart had become deeper than anything she had previously practiced. The city had no use for a half-grown girl with strange eyes and no voice. The officials who moved among the survivors with lists and dry compassion quickly decided that she belonged in one of the overcrowded homes set aside for orphans and discarded children. In those places, names blurred and futures were negotiated through labor contracts. Myra was cataloged as mute, physically healthy, docile. Her gaze, however, moved too sharply. Too v'en tracing the walls, the doors, the expressions of those who came to select new workers for their households. From within that gray stream of days came a new turn in her path. Someone from the inner office of the Alpha's administration visited the home, looking for children small enough to be unobtrusive and old enough to carry out simple tasks. Myra was noticed for all the reasons others overlooked her. She never cried, never begged, and never spoke. She seemed willing to obey without protest, and her supposed disability made her appear harmless. Papers were signed above her head. Soon after, she found herself crossing the threshold of a building no ordinary citizen entered without invitation or fear. The administrative house of the clan stood slightly apart from the rest of the district, built of dark stone with narrow windows and a carved emblem of a wolf's head watching the street. Inside, hallways smelled of ink, leather, and old dust. Voices were fewer, but sharper. These minds turned around power, strategy, and the careful maintenance of the city's fragile equilibrium. Myra carried coal for the heaters, water for the kitchens, and stacks of documents from office to office. She moved along the edges of rooms like a shadow, learning to use not only physical, but also mental corners to shield herself from the worst of the constant mental murmur. Her silence, which in the neighborhood had been a mark of pity, became in this house a convenient feature. Clerks and officers adapted quickly to her presence. They pointed, gestured, handed her keys, assumed she understood enough to follow routine instructions. No one tried to involve her in conversations, to draw her into pointless chatter. She responded with nods and small, precise movements. Her eyes stayed low, but her attention did not. Every paper laid out on a table, every map studded with markers, every stray thought about patrol rotations or disputed cargo routes slid past her awareness, becoming part of an invisible pattern she built inside herself. In that building, under the roof where decisions for the entire city were weighed, Myra crafted a new version of her vow. She would not only hold her tongue, she would also clamp down on the reflex to mirror what she felt and heard. The worst slips still happened when fear or anger shook her control, so she disciplined herself to stay steady, to breathe evenly, to let emotions pass through her like water through cloth without catching. She imagined erecting layers between her and the world. First skin, then bone, then a quiet inner room where only her own thoughts were allowed. By the time seasons changed, and the winds shifted from icy to merely cold, she had become part of the furniture in the inner office. A small, silent figure with scarred hands and a blank expression, invisible in the kind of way that allowed her to see everything. The city outside continued to live on fumes, smoke, and rumors, held together by the unspoken agreement between humans and wolves. Myra did not yet know that her concealed voice and unwanted gift would one day crack that fragile balance. For now, she simply hid, listening to the heartbeat of the city through its most guarded walls and pretending, for her own survival, that she did not exist. The clan council building stood on the highest rise of the northern district, a dark rectangular silhouette that watched over the port, the maze of shanty rooftops, and the distant flicker of lighthouse beacons. By day it resembled an ordinary administrative structure, its tall facade and narrow windows giving it a cold, bureaucratic dignity. By night, however, the building shed its civilian mask. It became the hidden heart of the city's most dangerous machinery, a den where shifters arrived from all districts, carrying reports, injuries, suspicions, and verdicts. Decisions made here shaped the flow of ships, the direction of trade routes, and the invisible alliances that kept the fragile coexistence between humans and wolves from collapsing. Myra quickly understood that survival inside these walls required far more than obedience or speed. It demanded invisibility so complete that even eyes trained to capture the smallest movements overlooked her. She moved along the edges of rooms, skimming past heavy tables layered with maps and weapon inventories, slipping through doorways just as discussions began. Her tasks were simple: bringing water, tending to fires, delivering documents, but her skill lay in never being the center of anyone's focus. Behind her quiet face, however, her mind worked with relentless clarity. The thoughts she picked up from poorly shielded minds fell into her awareness like fragments of torn letters dropped along a trail. A hostile intention here, a hurried memory of a forbidden meeting there, a list of shipments that did not match any official logs. Piece by piece, she arranged these fragments into a pattern only she could see. Which dock workers sold shipping schedules to rival clans, which patrols were bribed to look the other way when smugglers crossed the borders, which powerful families shifted their loyalties under the cover of polite compliance. Night brought the most noise. When senior wolves gathered in the hall, their barely restrained instincts made their thoughts bleed through the thin partition between human and beast. Rage had its own texture, a hot, metallic surge, while suspicion moved like icy cracks along the spine. When arguments grew heated, the mix of images they projected was overwhelming. Torn nets, silver bullets, claw marks on snow, the faces of traitors remembered with visceral hatred. Myra often kept to the farthest corners of hallways, yet even from behind thick stone walls, she sometimes felt the impact of their emotions like blows from an unseen fist. Outside the council, a larger tension was building across the city. Fishermen whispered about wolf patrols disappearing into the forest and never returning. Rumors spread through taverns that crates labeled as salt hid silver, a weapon forbidden under the ancient treaty between humans and shifters. Families in human districts shut their shutters earlier each night, sensing the uneasy pulse running through the streets. Beyond the walls, torchlight sometimes flickered as search parties scoured the forest for missing people. Every disturbance, every fearful rumor eventually found its way into the council building in the form of rapid footsteps, the metallic smell of blood, or hastily whispered orders passed between officers. Myra remained an observer. She had no permission to warn anyone and no safe way to break the silence she had sworn to maintain. Her ability was too volatile. If she attempted to speak even a single sentence, it might be contaminated by someone else's secrets. A single misplaced word could drag hidden intentions into the open, an act that could unravel alliances, reveal crimes, or ignite feuds that simmered beneath the city's thin peace. In a world of wolves and fragile truces, truth was often more dangerous than a blade. Still, she watched. She watched and waited, gathering threads of knowledge the way others gathered weapons. She knew which border would break first if conflict erupted, which patrol routes overlapped suspiciously often, and which officers avoided looking one another in the eye. Her silence was both her shield and her prison, and she reinforced it daily with the discipline of someone who had no other means of survival. One night, however, something disrupted the rigid rhythm of the council. The doors were thrown open, and a draft carrying the scent of rain and blood swept through the hall. A group of guards entered, dragging behind them a wolf in half-human form. His clothing was torn, his limbs trembling with exhaustion, but the danger he radiated was unmistakable. Around his throat hung a metal insignia, an emblem belonging not to Raynar's clan, but to one of the city's oldest and most hostile rivals. They brought him in as a prisoner, captured in a skirmish on the northern border. Arguments erupted at once. Some demanded interrogation, others an exchange, others insisted on an execution meant to send a message. Myra stood in her usual alcove, her hands wrapped around a stack of documents she had forgotten to deliver. She kept her eyes down, but when the guards led the prisoner past her, something in the air shifted sharply. The moment he crossed her path, the space inside her mind split open. The thoughts that surged from him were not the frantic, broken noise of someone fearing for his life. They were organized, burning with cold purpose. Beneath the surface pain, beneath the forced submission, lay a steady, unshakable certainty. His mind held no obsession with survival. Instead, it carried a vision of something planned, something monstrous, something already in motion. He was not frightened of death because death was irrelevant to him. The true strike had not yet fallen. He had come here expecting to be caught, expecting to be interrogated, expecting to die. His capture was not a failure. It was a step. And in the depths of his mind, Myra glimpsed the shape of a conviction so intense it left a metallic taste in her mouth. The city would not withstand what was coming. Raynar's dominion, the uneasy coexistence between humans and wolves, the entire structure of control shaped over decades. It was all about to be tested in a way no one in the council hall suspected. The prisoner's certainty clung to her even after he was dragged away. For the first time in years, Myra felt her silence tremble as though a crack had appeared along its surface. She pressed her fist to her mouth, afraid of what might spill out if she dared to speak. She had never believed that silence could protect her forever. But this was the first night she understood that silence might no longer protect anyone else. Raynar rarely appeared in the council building during daylight. Like most wolves of ancient lineage, he preferred to spend the sunlit hours in a state of disciplined half-slumber, enclosed within the fortified estate on the outskirts where outsiders were never allowed. Night, however, belonged to him. When dusk fell and the industrial haze thickened above the city, he became the gravitational center around which the entire pack revolved. Some feared him, many respected him, and a few quietly resented him for the ruthless efficiency with which he maintained order. Raynar cared little for either fear or reverence. He valued only results. He had no patience for tales of destiny or signs etched by the moon. Those stories were, in his view, nothing but comforting myths for wolves too afraid to carry the weight of their own decisions. Prophecies were excuses. Instinct and strategy were real. Rumors about a mute girl who hears too much reached him in fragments, drifting through the corridors like dust stirred by passing boots. He dismissed them as the usual superstition that grew in places drenched in fear and long nights. Servants invented miracles when they were bored, and monsters when they were uneasy. Nothing in the city's crumbling social structure required mystical explanations. Not yet. But then the pattern began. It started with minor anomalies, intercepted shipments that no scout had reported, ambushes that dissolved before they fully formed, and patrols that arrived at the right place at the right time, as if following instructions none of them had received. Twice, smuggled silver was seized before the council even discussed the intelligence report describing its route. A careful internal audit found no evidence of betrayal within the senior wolves, nor any sign that human workers had been feeding information to a rival faction. Everyone insisted they were loyal, and in most cases, their thoughts affirmed it. And yet dangerous information was somehow leaking in directions that always ended with the same result: the city being saved by a margin so thin it felt orchestrated. Myra felt the tension before anyone spoke of it. The thoughts of those around her had become sharper, more frantic, as though the entire building held its breath. The fear she absorbed during each night shift left a dull ache at the base of her skull. Through it all, she noticed how the space around Raynar tightened, loyalty mixed with suspicion, frustration tinged with unspoken desperation. The Alpha sensed the cracks forming but forced discipline onto his pack with an iron edge. His rational mind, unyielding, precise, kept returning to the same conclusion. There was an unknown variable inside the council itself. Something subtle, something overlooked. Raynar began watching. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. One night he stayed in the building longer than usual, packing its corridors with deliberate slowness, observing everything from the rhythm of patrol reports to the ways servants moved around important conversations. The pack knew the texture of his presence and unconsciously stepped aside, leaving him a wide corridor wherever he went. He noticed the quiet girl on his second circuit through the lower hall. At first, she registered only as a blur, a small figure gliding between tables with a bucket or stack of papers. But the longer he watched, the more something about her unsettled his wolf. She didn't move like someone who wished to be unseen. She moved like someone who had mastered the art of disappearing. People's gazes slid away from her without effort. Even the pack's heightened senses rarely tracked her for more than a second before dismissing her as irrelevant. Raynar did not dismiss things easily. Over the next nights, he tested her presence without acknowledging it outright. He altered patrol routes, issued contradictory instructions, and sent decoys to create false patterns. More than once he appeared in a corridor at a moment so sudden it caused the guards to startle. Each time, he expected to find evidence of a spy, a messenger, a traitor. Instead, he found the mute girl. Always precisely where the tension converged. Always just outside the rooms where the most consequential decisions were made. Always present when misinformation inexplicably collapsed before it reached its intended target. The more Raynar observed, the less coincidence seemed plausible. When a rival clan launched a sudden strike on the port, timed suspiciously close to a confidential discussion inside the council. Raynar sensed, for the first time in years, the slow burn of something close to dread. His wolves fought hard and repelled the attack, but the casualties were higher than expected. Throughout the night, Myra felt the raw grief and fury radiating from every patrol returning through the gates. Raynar walked among the wounded without speaking. His thoughts were buried too deep for her to catch fully, but she sensed a single recurring impression echoing across the hall. Something is wrong at the foundation. For a wolf accustomed to control, to predictability, to the fierce certainty of instinct, the idea that an unseen force was influencing the fate of his city was intolerable. His mind rejected prophecy, but even his wolf felt the faint pressure of something beyond strategy curling through the council halls. Each time Myra appeared in his peripheral vision, that pressure sharpened. She didn't look dangerous. She looked half broken, half invisible, and yet his senses, wolf and human, responded to her with a tension he could not categorize. His instincts whispered warnings in the back of his skull. His rationality whispered questions. She drifted through the building like a thread woven into every major incident he tried to untangle. Raynar did not believe in omens, but he believed in patterns. And no pattern in the council building was as consistent as the quiet girl who never spoke. He now faced a question that no amount of logic could easily solve. Was she the hidden threat that had slipped beneath his guard? Or was she the last fragile barrier standing between his pack and a catastrophe none of them yet saw coming? Tension inside the city had risen to the point of suffocation. The council halls felt heavier each night, as if the air itself thickened with the weight of unspoken fear. The usual conflicts among smugglers, rival packs, and territorial disputes now blended into something far more coordinated. Someone had begun supplying silver not for profit, but for ritual. Someone among the humans had learned to bind old magic into metal and carve symbols that did not belong to any known wolf clan. Rumors spread through the lower districts first, carried by frightened workers whose families had seen too many strange fires on the outskirts. They spoke of a sect that worshipped not the moon but a formless void, a force that promised freedom from the beast, from instinct, from the hunger of the wolf. Their symbol, an empty circle crossed by a crooked line, began appearing almost nightly on shipping crates, wharf posts, and even on back alley doors. It mirrored the scar that had cut across the moon's surface after the strange celestial storm weeks earlier. Some believed the sky itself had become a portent. Others believed the scars in the heavens were merely being used as a convenient tool to manipulate the frightened. As Myra moved along her daily routes through the council building, she began to catch fragments in the minds around her, jagged thoughts, half-formed fears, and dark ambitions tied to those symbols. Young wolves imagined a future where the moon might fail them, trapping them in their beast forms forever. Humans seduced by the new faith envisioned a city stripped of all wolf dominance, a city where the ancient laws no longer bound them. Their hopes and nightmares tangled inside Myra's mind like threads pulled too tight. She pieced together a pattern long before anyone else even suspected a conspiracy. The sect was preparing something vast, something threaded through both the docks and the abandoned industrial zones. She could feel outlines of their plan vibrating through the thoughts of those who had brushed against them. Warehouses, old warehouses, a bridge, tunnels beneath the grain elevator, and containers filled with something sharp and cold, something that smelled of silver mixed with a dead kind of magic. The ritual they intended would not only cripple a pack, it would warp the balance of the entire city, ripple outward into madness. She knew all this, and yet she remained silent. Speaking had always been the most dangerous choice available to her. Her voice did not belong only to her. It dragged the secrets of everyone around her into the open, stripping minds bare and scattering their hidden fears across every word she uttered. If she spoke near wolves, especially senior wolves whose authority depended on carefully contained truths, She could ignite internal revolt before the real enemy had even struck. But the pressure kept growing. Every night the thoughts she sensed grew darker, more tangled. Every day she felt the weight of time tightening around her like a noose. The breaking point came during a high council meeting. The hall was crowded with senior wolves, strategists, and enforcers. Reports were scattered across tables. Maps were smeared with notes and clawed markings. The council debated launching a decisive strike against the rival wolf faction believed to be orchestrating the silver shipments. Voices rose, tempers flared, and Myra lingered near the door with a tray, unnoticed as usual. Except this time, Raynar's attention snagged on her. Something in her posture was wrong, too still, too deliberate. The same faint scent of fear and purpose drifted from her skin. His wolf stiffened in response, alert to danger. He gave a subtle command. A guard stepped aside. Myra was summoned into the hall before she could retreat back into the shadows. Suddenly she stood exposed in the center of the chamber, surrounded by towering wolves whose thoughts pressed against her mind like hot metal. The air turned suffocating. Their suspicion, their arrogance, their secrets, all of it struck her at once. The room vibrated with voices she wasn't meant to hear. Her heart battered against her ribs. Her silence trembled under the weight of everything she could not say. If she kept quiet, the city would burn. If she spoke, she would break the world open. The choice dissolved before she fully made it. Her voice tore out of her like lightning splitting a storm. She spoke without intention, without control, her words carrying truths ripped directly from the minds around her. She revealed the coordinates of the sect's hidden caches, the names of humans feeding silver into the city under the guise of legitimate trade, the rival wolves who secretly negotiated with the void worshippers, and the rituals being prepared beneath the grain elevator. She named betrayals whispered in nightmares, confessions buried deep beneath pride, and wounds the pack refused to acknowledge. Faces blanched. Wolves staggered as their own fears echoed through Myra's voice. Some reached for her in panic. Others recoiled as though burned. A few bolted for the exits, guilty minds unable to hide now that their secrets had been given form. And finally, she spoke the thoughts Raynar himself had buried. His doubts about his own leadership. The instinctive sense that something much worse than a rival pack was unfolding. The fear that he was losing control of the city he had sworn to protect. The hall fell into a stunned silence once the torrent of revelations ceased. Raynar stared at her as if witnessing a creature born from prophecy, despite all his disbelief. For the first time he understood that whatever Myra was, she was not a spy, not a traitor, not a pawn. She was a force he had misjudged entirely. And her existence posed a choice with no clear path. Destroy the girl whose voice could unravel any council, any alliance, any wolf's authority. Or protect her and face the consequences of allowing a truth speaker to walk among beasts built on secrets. The cost of her silence had been heavy. The cost of her truth was heavier still. And before the night was over, the entire city would begin to fracture beneath the weight of what she had unleashed. The night began with an unnatural stillness, the kind that pressed against the windows and crawled beneath the skin long before any sound of battle reached the streets. Myra felt it first, not as a noise or vibration, but as a sudden shift inside the minds she could not ignore. Thoughts sharpened in places where they were usually dull, emptied where they were usually full. Someone far north of the city felt a flash of triumph. Someone near the grain elevator felt reverence. Someone in the council building felt fear so sharp it tasted like metal. It was the kind of fear that knew something was coming, but hoped desperately not to see it. Raynar sensed it, too, but differently. His wolf had paced inside him all day as if something in the air carried a scent too faint for human senses. The moon loomed overhead, scarred and pale, the jagged shadow across its face seeming deeper than usual. His instincts warned him that the night would break the routine of hunts, patrols, and political maneuvering. This was the restlessness of an alpha who felt the edges of his territory tremble. His people looked to him as a shield and a blade. But tonight something whispered that even a blade could dull, and even a shield could crack. When the ritual ignited at the abandoned grain elevator, the entire city shuddered. Wolves dropped to their knees on rooftops. Patrols staggered mid-stride. Those in human form clutched the nearest wall as if gravity had suddenly shifted sideways. Myra gasped from the force of the psychic blow. It wasn't sound, but it tore through her skull like broken glass carried on a storm. She felt the moon connection thin, stretch, and warp. Felt it as if someone were pulling on threads inside a dozen minds at once, threatening to tear through them. Raynar collapsed for a single breath. His heartbeat faltered. The wolf inside him roared in panic, clawing at the fraying bond with the sky. Losing the moon meant losing control, losing purpose, losing the anchor that had shaped him since childhood. But the weakening lasted only a moment. A brief flicker instead of the full severing the ritual had intended. His vision cleared, and strength returned unevenly, like blood flowing back into a limb that had fallen asleep. He rose to his feet, furious, not at the enemy, but at the realization that someone had tried to separate him from the part of himself he trusted most. The city erupted in chaos. Silver dust scattered on the wind from the harbor, burning the lungs of wolves. Fires broke out around the warehouses. Wolves leapt across rooftops, shadows clashing with other shadows. Human sect members moved through alleys with torches and knives, their thoughts a peculiar mix of religious awe and cold determination, all feeding into Myra's mind as if she were standing inside each skull at once. Raynar gathered his core fighters and moved to the council building, ready to command the defense. He expected chaos. He expected blood. He did not expect to find Myra already waiting, pale but steady, as if she had been dragged into the storm by a force stronger than her fear. Once she had been a nameless servant he barely noticed. Then she became an oddity, a question without an answer. Now she stood beside the map table with her hands clenched tightly at her sides, and her eyes, those quiet, watchful eyes, held the reflection of a battlefield she had never stepped onto. She looked breakable at first glance, but something deeper pulsed beneath her fragility, a mind sharper than any blade, and a loneliness that had shaped every movement she made. For Raynar, it was the first time he understood that her silence had not been emptiness, but restraint. For Myra, standing in the command room was like standing at the center of a storm formed entirely of other people's thoughts. Rage and panic surged around her, each emotion accompanied by images: claws, rooftops, knives, falling bodies, burning sails. She felt her own fear swell, but unlike the nights she had spent hiding behind brooms and buckets, she could no longer afford to retreat. Too many minds were screaming for help or triumph or blood. And inside each thought was a clue, an angle, a direction, a shape of the coming strike. Raynar approached her reluctantly. His wolf bristled, uncertain whether she was a threat or something else entirely. Her presence was too quiet, too grounded, too aware. She looked at him as if she had seen him before he entered the room, not physically, but in some deeper sense. He resented the thought even as he recognized its truth. She lifted her gaze to the map, and for the first time her posture shifted. Not timid, not hidden, focused. She moved a hand toward the northern quadrant of the city. Her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of too many minds colliding inside her own. Raynar watched the way her throat moved as she swallowed back the noise. She had lost her voice for years, but now she forced it to return, forming words that were rough and uncertain from disuse. She gave him the next strike point. He listened. Not because he wanted to, but because some instinct inside him, a mix of wolf and man, understood that her knowledge was not guesswork, not rumor, not coincidence. It was something he could not explain, rooted in a part of the world no wolf could scent and no human could touch. Something that felt frighteningly close to prophecy, though Raynar had never believed in such things. Outside, the battle shifted as he followed her directions. He moved ahead of his fighters, pushing himself to the front lines where the night was thickest. Each location she pointed to revealed enemies exactly where she had sensed them. Men with silver vials waiting behind crates, wolves from the opposing clan preparing an ambush on a rooftop, a cult leader attempting to carve runes into a support beam beneath the marketplace. Raynar fought through each confrontation with the precision of a predator, guided not by instinct, but by something eerily similar to foresight. Between fights, his thoughts drifted unexpectedly to Myra. Not to her face or her presence, but to the sound of her voice, the rough, fragile tone of someone speaking after years of silence. There was no fear in that voice, only resolve, and something else he had not yet named. Back in the council building, Myra struggled to stay upright. The onslaught of thoughts was worse now that wolves were dying, killing, fleeing, calling for help through instinct and instinctive memory. She pressed her palms flat on the table to anchor herself, trying not to become lost in the flood. She felt every death like a brief extinguishing of light. She felt every moment of fear as if it were her own. But she also felt Raynar. Not his words, he wasn't thinking in those terms during battle, but she felt the shape of him, a blazing, sharp-edged force cutting through the fog of the night, a presence too fierce to confuse with any other. When he changed direction, she knew. When he pushed too hard, she felt the strain inside him. When he brushed near death, she sensed a sudden, cold silence that startled her enough to gasp aloud. Raynar returned near dawn, covered in blood, none of it his, but breathing heavily, exhausted, and still tense from the lingering effects of the ritual. Myra met his gaze for a moment, and in that brief exchange something passed between them. He saw the exhaustion behind her eyes, the toll her gift had taken. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of lives counted and lost. The city survived the night, but it did not remain unchanged. The cult's ritual had failed, yet it revealed cracks long hidden. Betrayal within the council surfaced. Fear simmered among the lower ranks. Wolves who once prided themselves on strength now questioned whether their power depended too heavily on the moon. Humans within the sect spoke of a future free of the pack's influence. And Myra found herself the center of all of it. Some wolves looked at her with gratitude, others with suspicion, envy, even hatred. She had revealed what they wanted buried. She had saved them, but not gently. Raynar made the announcement with the composure of an alpha who had already accepted the consequences. His voice was steady, commanding, and final. Myra would no longer be a nameless servant. She would no longer hide in silence. Her gift would be integrated into the pack's structure, protected, utilized. For the first time in her life, Myra felt fear not from others' thoughts, but from her own. Raynar, standing beside her, felt something different, a pull he didn't yet understand, a shift in the pattern of his instincts, a new gravity forming around someone who had been invisible for far too long. The night had changed the city, but it had changed them more. The city did not return to itself after the night of broken moonlight. It breathed differently, as if its lungs had been scorched and now drew air with new caution. The rooftops where wolves once ran with thoughtless confidence now felt heavier beneath their paws. The alleys where humans had once cowered widened into unfamiliar pathways of cooperation and distrust. Even the water at the harbor moved differently, slower, as if remembering the fires reflected in its surface. The city had survived, but survival had carved a mark across it that could not be polished clean. In the council building, change seeped into the walls like damp. New protocols appeared, new voices entered the chambers, and new silences took shape. A small room deep inside the building was given to Myra, not as a reward but as necessity. Its walls were thick, its lamps dim, its air oddly still. It became the only place where her mind could retreat from the constant barrage of foreign thoughts. Even then, it took time for her heartbeat to slow enough to understand where she ended and where others began. Raynar reorganized the governance of the city with a precision that felt both methodical and instinctive. He opened ranks traditionally reserved for wolves, to a handful of humans who had proven themselves during the attack. He dismantled 3 old committees built on personal loyalties and replaced them with mixed teams who answered not to a species, but to duty. He allowed information coming from Myra's gift to guide certain decisions, though he never admitted publicly how deeply her insights shaped the night patrol routes or the distribution of resources. The changes were subtle in appearance but seismic beneath the surface. Some wolves left the city entirely, unable or unwilling to live under a system where hidden truths could be dragged into the open simply by being near the wrong person. A few humans abandoned their shops to join new settlements inland, fearing that the balance between wolf and man could never truly hold. Others remained, watching carefully, moving cautiously, testing whether the new structure would stabilize or collapse. Myra noticed each shift in the way minds recoiled or stretched. She saw guilt thicken like smoke in the subconscious of those who had dabbled with the cult. She felt resentment simmer in wolves who resented her influence, even as they benefited from her presence. She learned that truth itself had weight, and that weight was almost always unwelcome. Her ability, once suppressed to protect others, had become the foundation of a fragile order. It terrified her. Raynar felt the fear in her even when she sat still and composed. His awareness of her grew sharper after the night of the ritual, as if some thread had connected them in the dark. It wasn't mystical or emotional in appearance, it was instinctive. Whenever she struggled under the noise of too many thoughts, something in him stirred, alert and restless, like his wolf sensed a change in the wind. He began checking on her without announcing his intentions, stepping into her doorway with the quiet tread of a predator who had learned to soften his presence. At first, he lingered only moments, pretending to observe a report or monitor the staff. But gradually, his pauses grew longer. He found himself watching the precise way she steadied her breathing, the careful tension in her hands as she filtered the mental landscape around her. Her fragility was not weakness. It was the restraint of someone who held far more than she allowed to escape. He had spent years navigating dangers that clawed and bit. He had never imagined danger that whispered. Myra found his presence strangely grounding. His mind was not quiet, but it was structured, layered in a way that felt almost protective. The wolf inside him radiated a different kind of frequency than human thought, dense, primal, anchored. When he stood near her, the cacophony of the city faded just slightly, as though his inner beast absorbed or repelled the excess. For someone who had lived suffocated by unfiltered emotions, Raynar's presence was the first form of silence she had ever known that came from outside herself. Their interactions took place in the quiet, in the spaces between tasks and crises. They never touched. They rarely made eye contact for long. Yet something both delicate and immense formed between them, built not of words but of endurance. Myra let him remain near her longer than she ever allowed anyone else. Raynar found himself adjusting schedules, patrol rotations, and political meetings simply to ensure she wasn't overwhelmed. Neither acknowledged these shifts. Neither had to. The city observed them with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. Some saw Myra as a stabilizing force. Others saw her as a threat that Raynar had foolishly permitted too close. The wolf hierarchy bristled at the idea of an outsider. Worse, a human, occupying a position of influence without formal rank. The human population whispered about the strange truce, wondering whether it signaled safety or danger. The truth was neither side understood the bond forming in the shadows. It did not fit into their politics or fears. And while tensions brewed outside, something quieter unfolded within Raynar. The night of the attack had left its mark on him as surely as on the city. His connection to the moon had wavered in a way he had never experienced. A scar formed, not physical but internal. A place in him that felt vulnerable, uncertain. He did not trust weakness, even his own. But when he stood near Myra, that vulnerability did not feel like a threat. It felt seen, not judged. Myra bore her own scar, not from a wound inflicted during battle, but from the irreversible shift that came with breaking her silence. She could never return to anonymity. Her gift, once locked behind closed lips, now had shape and consequence. And though she feared it, she also recognized its necessity. She looked at Raynar, at the wolf who had governed this city through strength alone, and realized her presence softened the edges of his leadership in ways he would never admit aloud. He was still a blade, but she had become the whetstone that guided its direction. Nights passed where Raynar stood on the highest rooftop of the council building, staring at the scar across the moon. He felt the tension of his pack ripple through the city, the uncertainty of wolves who questioned their place in a world that was changing faster than they could adapt. And nearly every time he turned his head, he felt Myra behind him. Quiet steps, careful distance, presence steady as a heartbeat. She joined him not to offer comfort, but to share the burden of watching a sky that no longer offered answers. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the lingering silence between them was an understanding deeper than declarations. The new order settled slowly, like ashes drifting to the ground after a long fire. It was imperfect and precarious, but alive. Myra's place within it remained undefined, suspended between human and wolf worlds, belonging to neither and necessary to both. Raynar became the anchor she had never sought but gradually leaned toward, while Myra became the clear-sighted steadiness he did not know he lacked. The scar on the moon stayed, a pale reminder of the night everything shifted. Myra often stared at it from her small room, sensing its weight the way she sensed thoughts, distant yet pressing. She did not fear it anymore. Scars were not meant to vanish. They were meant to remind. Raynar carried his own inner scar with similar resolve. He no longer tried to hide the ways the night had changed him. He did not avoid Myra, nor deny the unspoken tether that formed between them. He learned to protect not only with his teeth and strength, but with awareness, restraint, and a quieter kind of loyalty. They stood side by side, not lovers, not bound by fate, but connected by something rarer. A shared survival, a shared burden, a shared scar forged beneath a broken moon. And in that fragile, wordless closeness, the city found its new beginning. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.